Hello, back with another check-in from The West Beyond the West by Gene Barman, A History of British Columbia, with guest star by Little Doodle, who's not going to sit on me during this, or maybe will sit on me. So we're Chapter 9, A Growing... Doodle's lifting the camera. This is Growing Self-Confidence, 1900 to 1918. Which in some ways makes it one of these chapters that I think, I'll zoom through this chapter pretty quickly because talking about it, at least because a lot of it is very kind of economics based, though it actually comes up with a lot of the seeds for what British Columbia would become, which I mean, I guess all these histories do. Starting off with the idea that political life in government, it stabilized because the party system was brought in. Before that, it wasn't. It was basically if you would kind of cobble together like interests kind of on a ad hoc basis. But this is when we actually kind of solidify into political parties. And the fellow who actually really benefits from that is the conservative Richard McBride, born and raised in New Westminster, one of the first kind of BC bred politicians, received his law degree at Nova Scotia's Dalhousie, and practiced for a time in Atlan, a Northwest mining community. He is the guy who, he became premier in 1903 under the banner of the Conservative Party, inheriting what was considered at the time a large debt of it's like, what is it, 1898 they were at $12.5 million in debt, and there was a definite anxiety of like, was BC going to be able to pay for itself? What happened during McBride's run, which is a fairly long run for a BC politician at this point, where you could really cycle through them quickly, some of them, a lot of them dying in office, was that there was boom times. There was suddenly a lot of demand for the BC staples of, especially lumber, salmon, raw materials, a lot of stuff like that, and which ends up with, they end up with a surplus, and in this surplus you get the boom times, and what do they say, it's like basically McBride both exploited and became caught up in the boom sweeping British Columbia and Canada as a whole. To quote Margaret Ormsby, more than anyone else, he typified the spirit of the age, the optimism which verged on recklessness. And we see a lot of that with him actually, there being a big boom in a craze really in building railway lines, and like even with the ones that were actually finally built, there was probably too many, basically too many for the economy of BC to be able to sustain in any matter. And once the boom had ended, we ended up with tracks that weren't completed or didn't get completed for a long time, or stuff like being from the Okanagan Valley, the Kettle Valley Railway is one that I know of. I know of because I would walk along the disused track and go over the trestles that were still there. And I think is actually kind of turned into a little bit of a historical site now because they're not used. They're not used anymore. They also have stuff here of McBride benefited in several ways, including pandering to the anti-Asian sentiment by obtaining agreement that, unlike the CPR, only white labor would be used to build one of these new lines, the Grand Trunk Pacific. And it was, so there is definitely constant dottings through here of the racism of the time yet again. But it's also kind of striking about like how in foreign investment, foreign money starts pouring in to British Columbia at this time. This really is that BC is connected. I mean, it was connected with the fur trade, but as it continues along as a province, it was connected with world economy, and with large amounts of investments, like 2/3 of foreign money from Brits, a ton of money from the U.S. The U.S. Um, what was money is going from, like, in the 1905, was it like also just the lumber, the U.S. Put a large part of its forests into parks, and then that caused a lot of the U.S. lumber money to come up to BC, which was completely not regulated, and going from 9% of the revenues uh, in like 1902 to, by 6 years later, 40% of the much larger provincial budget of the time. So suddenly, as we now have at the moment, a lot of the money that comes into BC, a lot of the money that's in BC is foreign money, which is definitely something that will go forward. There was also just this thing of, you know, basically a lot of the leases on crown land where all the lumber was really unregulated, really open to corruption, was snapped up. And unfortunately, by the time they actually put in that regulation, 80% of Crown timberland had been leased, which really gets you that sense of the corrupt legislators of the time saying, like, okay, we've basically made all the money we're gonna make off of this, and now we'll regulate it after the fact, which, is unfortunately is one of those things. Uh, yeah, in 1900, total investment in BC timber stood at about 2 million. By 1914, it had reached 150 million, of which American investment comprised 90 million. So, and 3 years later, British Columbia surpassed every other Canadian province in lumber production. This was the explosion of the Canadian lumber industry, and it's kind of significant to say, even at this point, it was a largely American-owned um, industry, um, which is one of those kind of sobering thoughts to think of. We have a lot of things of halcyon days of Canadian companies. It's like, well, no, actually, from the beginning, there's a ton of American cash that was funding and controlling and deciding a lot of the stuff that was happening in British Columbia. Probably reflecting just sort of the internationalization of business in general, and BC being a product of that, and beneficiaries as well as whatever else. It's the settlers definitely benefiting from that. There's also the kind of automation in salmon canning, which radically cut labor forces, at a time when the labor forces were actually getting to the point where we could actually demand better wages. At that point, that made it very profitable to bring in automation to cut all those jobs. Oh joy, oh joy. There's also kind of notes here about how urbanized BC is. That's maybe not something that people think about, but, like, by 1891, 43% of British Columbians lived in incorporated cities, towns, villages of 1,000 or more, and um, and and what is this? And at 51%, British Columbia just maintained its lead over its next rival, Ontario, in later in like, was it, yeah, 60, yeah, if you take out non-native, you take out native populations, it was like it was actually over Ontario as an urban center. And indeed, Vancouver itself, as the major urban center of British Columbia, is probably a big thing with that. Yeah, Vancouver, this is like in 1911, Vancouver had 100,000 population, Victoria almost 32,000, and then New West 13, Nanaimo 8. It's like the British Columbia had a relatively few number of urban centers, but they were really, really, really big and significant. Vancouver being the one that dwarfs everything as kind of a major service center, basically the place where all the the major companies that had branches in that had their main branch in Ontario would also have a branch in Vancouver. Ones that had been in Victoria moved over. There's definitely that thing of we're shifting over. That definitely Victoria becomes just kind of the center of government and of tourism, playing up the old English angle to attract tourists, British middle class tourists and immigrants. Um, it's in during this time that we get a lot of kind of the buildings that are known of in Vancouver, at least by a certain generation. The Woodwards, the Hudson's Bay Company, and Burke's buildings become landmarks. There's a Carnegie Library. There's which we also have one in Victoria. Well, we had one in Victoria, it then became a bank, then is something else now. Um, you know, we've got we've got English Bay. A lot of the development. It's interesting that while CPR wasn't the major employer anymore, it still was a major deal in real estate, and indeed was because of the lines that kind of cut through Vancouver and the Lower Mainland became a major real estate developer with you know with Kerrisdale, Shaughnessy Heights, kind of very exclusive Tony neighborhoods even to this day. Um, you know, and also a kind of a note here about the poor ended up in the kind of the original residential areas, lying between Granville and Hastings Mill. It became as known as the East End, which the Vancouver's East End is still houses a lot of the poor with large boarding houses. Most of the city's 3 to 4 thousand Chinese lived in Chinatown in the East End. Um, you know, that's this area um, is to this day kind of that area where the lower rungs of our society get shoved or get funneled, sometimes from all over the country. There's the idea of, let's go to the BC where the weather isn't as cold. I mean, it's not as cold, it's just wet all the time and brutal in its own ways. At least if you're someone without any money. UBC started to get put together in was it 1915? The University of British Columbia opened its temporary facilities at Fairview because of construction delays. The move to its permanent home on the Point Grey Cliffs came only after the First World War. I'm going to get to the First World War. Yeah, we have stuff about Victoria, its shift from kind of business deindustrialized to a government and tourist attraction. Um, you know, and just that thing of it, kind of this thing of, was it? There's a quote here from Kipling reported enthusiastically on visiting, quote, that quite English town of beautiful streets, that on £1,000 a year, pounds a year pension, a man could be a millionaire in these parts, and on 400 he could live well. The Times of London considered Victoria the most English of the towns in Canada. So Victoria grows, but Vancouver grows a lot faster. Um, you know, and this kind of really does create kind of what you become known as now is like the two very different BCs. You have the very kind of urbanized, kind of affluent, lots of services, um, you know, that side, the urban side of BC, and then you've got the other half. Maybe here in 1911, it's the other like 40% of the province, which is the kind of the frontier or small areas that don't actually have. There's a real drop off of access to healthcare, to schooling, to professional expertise. It's funny, I know this. I was living up island for a good while, and it became kind of necessary. Like, well, we need some other services. It's why we moved down to an urban center. So that kind of that divide of the what's called generally the interior versus the lower mainland, which some ways does encompass Victoria as well. It's like we're the lower mainland, this very urbanized center versus the interior country, you know, that sort of thing. Um, Now, the boom can't go on forever, and outside events affect things. And you get the World War One, and basically capital dries up. Outside capital began to pull back, and they're talking about like the annual value of building permits in Vancouver dropped by half to 10 million, and then to just 4 million in 1914. Um, and all these railways that had gotten kind of built on a kind of a vision of it, just the boom times are going to go forever, suddenly are a really bad idea. And some of them get consolidated and pulled together. Some railways don't get extended as far as they were going to get extended, and some just that's it. They kind of go out of business. Um, you know, there's a kind of definitely a note to the thing of um, of how much of a company place BC was. Stuff along the lines of basically companies would own towns. Basically, they would construct them, they would provide the services for them, and I mean this could be a double-edged sword. You would get better schools, better infrastructure because it's a company town and they want things to run smoothly. You also had things like employees of different ethnic and racial groups were usually housed separately to the satisfaction of the dominant society. Powell River, where Asian workers were prohibited by terms of the water use agreement signed with the provincial government, possessed a Balkan village, and for the Italian families, a separate cluster of small company homes on the other side of the dam from the main community. Um, and but and and the thing is, you were also kind of entrapped by the company in that there was a company store where you could buy anything you wanted as long as you had a coupon. The coupons, of course, would be deducted from your paycheck, and people ended up with they'd get to the end of the month and they'd have a dollar or two left. Um, they have a thing of unions were prohibited. Pro-labor newspapers mailed to subscribers, so it was charged, were destroyed by the postmaster who had set himself up as censor. And in conjunction with the village policeman, decided that working class publications were not fit to be distributed. So far as personal liberty was concerned, company towns were nothing but quote slave encampments. And there was some kind of worries about this. Duff Pattullo is a name that will come up again in 1917. Worries about kind of the companies sometimes exercising autocratic power in the way of administrating by refusing entry of persons other than those that they were willing to admit into these company towns. This is a time when there were liberals and there were conservatives in our in as the dominant political groups, and anyone actually left liberal is just sort of left of center kind of politicians as well, very very mainstream. There wasn't any kind of working class political representation at this time. They have a thing here about World War One and how that British Columbia had the highest per capita volunteer rate in Canada, adjusted over 90 per thousand population, compared with about 75 in Ontario, and across the prairies just over 50 in the Maritimes, and half that in Quebec, it being the place with the largest number of British expats in it, and also being such kind of a high male percentage of the population, so you get a lot more. This, some small communities were irrevocably weakened by this, and just sort of ended up, families where people die, the males died, they would just kind of packed up and went back to either their province or country of origin. Um, you know, Luckily, with the stagnation in international trade was actually counteracted slightly, at least, by demand for domestic products. Um, you know, but that but and so as the crash comes, you know, McBride does finally resign in I think it's 1912. Um, you know, McBride's enthusiasm intensified the bust following the boom. He'd encouraged and even subsidized overexpansion. While it might have been possible to justify two major railways spanning British Columbia, in no way was it possible to argue for the number that were supported financially, much less the many other proposed and in some cases actually considered by the provincial government. Um, you know, they were caught up in the international economy, and we really just kind of by the end of 1915, Richard McBride was no longer a railway builder nor a politician extraordinaire, but the victim of the end of prosperity, which had permitted his success. Um, and saying that basically the politics after that was basically kind of an addendum to the McBride. You know, they had next his successor was defeated by scandals emanating from McBride's tenure. The Liberals came to power, successfully projecting themselves as a party of reform, clearing the air and beginning anew. Like the Conservatives, they governed for a full dozen years. In their case, 3 men would serve. But yeah, it's like uh, it's interesting of this period of McBride just basically kind of being like, yeah, yay, let's go in a kind of semi-reckless fashion, of a kind of a boom economy of spending like there was never going to be a bust, which we see with plenty of politicians. I think a lot of times of Alberta next to us, which is the big oil thing where they can be very, very flush. And there's always recriminations when the crash happens, because they haven't put away enough, I guess, or invested enough in other things. And BC has got the same thing with our, you know, we still depend greatly on our lumber industry. But yeah, I can see kind of the seeds in this of kind of left workers movement coming up in this. You know, continuing with the kind of the thing of like, yeah, the power of business and the companies in BC in this period being largely not counteracted. So yeah, I will leave it there. It's kind of a rambly talk, but I think I hit some of the major points. Next time, I will do Chapter 10, Reform and Its Limits, 1871 to 1929. So Barman is definitely not just kind of going year by year by year, but we're kind of going like, okay, let's talk about self-confidence, overconfidence, overenthusiasm, boom, bust, and we'll kind of for this period, and then now we're going to go, oh, let's go back and let's take a look at reform and its limits. So we'll see what we're reforming, what we're not reforming in this section of the book, The West Beyond the West. More videos later.